Cleopatra, a name that has echoed through centuries, wrapped in mystery, seduction, and power. She has been called the last pharaoh of Egypt, the lover of Caesar and Mark Antony, the enemy of Rome, the queen who dared to defy an empire. But behind the legends, the plays, and the Hollywood glamour lies a woman far more fascinating and far stranger than the myths suggest. In this video, we're going to uncover crazy, unbelievable, and often overlooked facts about Cleopatra. From dissolving pearls in vinegar to extravagant feasts that defied reason, from rumors of poison experiments to political maneuvers that shook the ancient world, Cleopatra's story is one of brilliance, boldness, and bizarre surprises. Now, before we dive into the world of ancient palaces, snake-filled legends, and political scandals, let me set the stage. You may think you know Cleopatra, the queen draped in gold, the seductress of Antony, the tragic figure who chose death over disgrace. But history is never that simple. Much of what we know about her comes not from Egyptians, but from her enemies, the Romans. And the Romans loved nothing more than to twist the truth. What survives is part fact, part propaganda, and part sheer legend. Our job is to untangle them. So, get comfortable. Pour yourself a cup of tea, dim the lights, and let's travel back more than 2,000 years to a world where politics was a game of survival, love was a weapon, and Egypt's last queen played both better than almost anyone else. I'm your host, and this is Dame of Legends, where history comes alive in stories of intrigue, myth, and wonder. If you love journeys into the past, make sure to stay with me as we peel back the layers of Cleopatra's world. So sit tight, relax, and get ready, because Cleopatra is about to surprise you. When most people think of Cleopatra, they imagine an Egyptian queen draped in linen and gold, ruling from the banks of the Nile. But here's the first crazy fact. Cleopatra wasn't Egyptian by blood at all. She was Greek. Cleopatra belonged to the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Macedonian Greek family that took control of Egypt after the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE. For nearly 3 centuries, her ancestors ruled from the great city of Alexandria, a cosmopolitan hub of learning and wealth. They styled themselves as pharaohs, but they lived more like Greek monarchs. They spoke Greek, worshipped Greek gods alongside Egyptian deities, and married almost exclusively within their own family to keep their bloodline pure. In fact, generations of brother-sister marriages had left the dynasty notorious for intrigue, jealousy, and betrayal. So when Cleopatra came to the throne in 51 BCE at the age of 18, she inherited more than a kingdom. She inherited a family legacy of infighting and paranoia, and a cultural tension between her Greek ancestry and her Egyptian subjects. And here's another extraordinary fact. Cleopatra may have been the first Ptolemy in nearly 300 years to actually learn the Egyptian language. While her ancestors ruled Egypt, they kept themselves distant from Egyptian culture, relying on Greek as the language of power. Cleopatra, however, did the opposite. Ancient writers note that she spoke not just Greek and Egyptian, but as many as 9 languages, including Hebrew, Aramaic, and even Ethiopian dialects. This linguistic brilliance gave her a political edge. Unlike her forebears, she could actually speak directly to the Egyptian people, priests, and officials without an interpreter. Imagine how radical that was. For centuries, Egypt's rulers had been foreign monarchs, aloof behind their Greek tongue. Then comes Cleopatra, a queen who could speak to her people in their own words, perform rituals in their own language, and present herself not just as a ruler on a throne, but as a true pharaoh in the ancient sense. Cleopatra carefully cultivated her public image. She styled herself as the living embodiment of the goddess Isis, a divine mother and protector figure deeply loved by Egyptians. In statues, she appears both in Greek dress and in the traditional Egyptian crown, bridging both worlds. To her Greek and Roman allies, she was a savvy monarch, fluent in diplomacy. To her Egyptian subjects, she was the earthly manifestation of their goddess. This ability to navigate multiple identities, Greek by blood, Egyptian by heart, was one of Cleopatra's greatest strengths. It made her not only a political survivor, but a cultural chameleon, able to adapt her image depending on her audience. It's also worth remembering that Cleopatra rose to power in a world where women were rarely sovereign rulers. The Ptolemies often placed queens alongside kings as co-rulers, but men still dominated politics. Cleopatra was different. She did not play the role of silent partner. Instead, she fought for her throne, first alongside her younger brother, whom she briefly married in the Egyptian tradition, then against him when he tried to oust her from power. She was exiled, raised an army, and returned to reclaim her crown. All of this before she even turned 22. The Romans later painted Cleopatra as nothing more than a seductress, a foreign temptress who bewitched Caesar and Antony. But facts about her identity show a very different picture. She was not defined solely by her relationships with powerful men. She was already a powerful woman before those alliances began. Her mastery of language, her ability to navigate between cultures, and her shrewd grasp of politics made her unique among her peers. Cleopatra's identity challenges our assumptions about history. She was Greek by ancestry, Egyptian by choice, multilingual in a world where most rulers spoke only one tongue, and a woman who wielded as much power as her male counterparts. Her life reminds us that identity is never simple. It is constructed, adapted, and performed. And Cleopatra was a master performer. So the next time someone imagines Cleopatra as a purely Egyptian queen with kohl-lined eyes and golden headdresses, remember, she was also a Greek scholar, a master diplomat, and perhaps one of the most adaptable leaders of the ancient world. Her identity was not a weakness. It was her ultimate weapon. When most people picture Cleopatra, they imagine a breathtakingly beautiful queen, a woman so alluring that she toppled empires and bent men like Caesar and Antony to her will. Hollywood has painted her in silk gowns and shimmering jewels, with Elizabeth Taylor's violet eyes and perfect eyeliner. But here's the crazy fact. By ancient accounts, Cleopatra's true power had very little to do with conventional beauty. Unlike modern rulers, Cleopatra didn't rely on airbrushed portraits or flattering paintings. Her image was stamped on coins that circulated throughout the Mediterranean. And these coins show a queen who looked striking, but not necessarily beautiful by today's standards. She had a strong nose, a firm chin, and sharp features. Roman writers, never shy about mocking their enemies, even described her looks as not remarkable. So how did a queen who didn't match traditional ideals of beauty captivate the most powerful men of her age? The answer lies in charisma, intelligence, and presence. Ancient historians like Plutarch admitted that while her appearance may not have been extraordinary, her voice, charm, and wit were irresistible. In other words, Cleopatra's beauty was in her brilliance. Plutarch wrote that Cleopatra's voice was like a many-stringed instrument, able to shift tones and moods effortlessly. She could converse with anyone in almost any language and make them feel seen, understood, and valued. This was her true weapon. In an age when most rulers spoke only their native tongue, Cleopatra's linguistic ability made her uniquely magnetic. Imagine sitting across from a queen who could speak to you in flawless Greek, switch to Egyptian to address her priests, then turn to Hebrew, Aramaic, or Latin, depending on her guest. That kind of presence doesn't just impress, it overwhelms. Cleopatra didn't need flawless features when she had a mind and a voice that could command the room. But Cleopatra was also practical. She knew the art of presentation, and she understood the science of seduction long before Hollywood. Ancient texts describe her mastery of perfumes and cosmetics. Alexandria was famous for its perfumeries, and Cleopatra reportedly owned entire laboratories dedicated to experimenting with new scents. She is even said to have written a book on cosmetics, blending recipes for makeup, hair treatments, and fragrances. Perfume in the ancient world was more than a pleasant luxury. It was a status symbol, a mark of divinity, and sometimes even a weapon. Cleopatra's ship, according to legend, sailed with purple sails drenched in perfume, the scent so strong it announced her arrival before she even came into view. That is not just wealth. That is performance art. Some sources claim Cleopatra's beauty rituals were not always harmless. Roman writers accused her of testing cosmetics and poisons on prisoners, seeking the perfect blend of allure and lethality. Whether true or propaganda, the rumor itself shows how deeply people associated her with dangerous beauty. She was not just a queen, she was a scientist of seduction, experimenting with every tool at her disposal. The Romans loved to reduce Cleopatra to a femme fatale, a woman who used her looks to manipulate men. But this was part of Octavian's smear campaign. By framing her as a foreign temptress, Rome could justify its conquest of Egypt. The truth was far more threatening. Cleopatra did not need her beauty to rule. She had intelligence, charisma, and an ability to bend culture itself to her will. Beauty may have been part of her arsenal, but it was never the full story. What makes Cleopatra's story so fascinating is how it challenges our idea of what beauty even means. For her, beauty was not about symmetry or soft features. It was about presence, the ability to make others feel her power, her intelligence, her divinity. She turned her so-called flaws into strengths, presenting herself not as a fragile beauty, but as a goddess in human form. And maybe that is the greatest crazy fact of all. Cleopatra, the woman remembered as history's ultimate seductress, conquered the world, not because she was beautiful, but because she was unforgettable. Cleopatra's story is often reduced to her famous romances, first with Julius Caesar, then with Mark Antony. Roman writers loved to paint her as a temptress who toppled men with beauty and seduction. But here's the crazy truth. These relationships were never just about love. They were about power, survival, and the fate of Egypt itself. Cleopatra wasn't simply in love. She was playing a high-stakes game of politics with two of the most powerful men the Roman world had ever produced. Let's start with Julius Caesar. In 48 BCE, Cleopatra's throne was under threat. Her brother, Ptolemy XIII, had forced her into exile, and the two siblings were at war. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria during his campaign, Cleopatra saw her chance. According to legend, she had herself smuggled into the palace, rolled up inside a carpet, or possibly a linen sack, and dramatically unfurled at Caesar's feet. Think about that for a moment. 18 years old, exiled from her kingdom, facing an uncertain future. And her plan is to sneak into the world's most powerful general's chambers in the dead of night. It was a gamble worthy of a legend. And it worked. Caesar was captivated, not just by her daring, but by her intelligence, charisma, and political savvy. Cleopatra and Caesar became lovers, but more importantly, allies. With Caesar's backing, Cleopatra defeated her brother and secured her throne. She also bore Caesar a son, Ptolemy XV Philopator Philometor Caesar, known to history as Caesarion. Though Caesar never publicly acknowledged the child, the connection gave Cleopatra immense prestige. Crazy fact. When Caesar returned to Rome, Cleopatra visited him, parading through the city not as a conquered queen, but as a royal guest, and scandalizing Roman society. For conservative Romans, the sight of their general entertaining a foreign monarch in his villa was shocking. They whispered that Cleopatra had bewitched him, that he was under her spell. But the truth was simpler. Cleopatra was brilliant at using spectacle to cement her influence. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, Cleopatra's position became dangerous again. She returned to Egypt only to face the rising power of another Roman strongman, Mark Antony. If Caesar was Rome's greatest general, Antony was its most flamboyant. When he summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus to explain her loyalty, she turned the meeting into a theatrical display. Cleopatra sailed up the Cydnus River in a barge with purple sails billowing in the wind, oars of silver flashing in the sun, and crew members dressed as cupids and sea nymphs. She herself reclined under a golden canopy, dressed as the goddess Isis, surrounded by clouds of incense and perfume. Antony was enthralled, and Cleopatra had secured another powerful Roman protector. Their relationship quickly deepened. Together they formed what became known as the Inimitable Livers Society, a kind of exclusive club devoted to lavish feasting, drinking, and revelry. Ancient sources describe banquets where guests wore costumes, drank rare wines, and spent fortunes in a single night. One story claims Cleopatra once bet Antony she could spend the equivalent of millions on a single meal. She then dissolved one of her priceless pearls in vinegar and drank it, winning the wager. But behind the revelry was politics. For Cleopatra, Antony represented the power of Rome, the only force strong enough to secure her dynasty and her son's future. For Antony, Cleopatra offered wealth, ships, and the grain of Egypt, resources he desperately needed in his struggles against Octavian, Caesar's heir. Their relationship was as much a political alliance as it was a romance. Crazy fact. Together they even staged a mock coronation in Alexandria, declaring Caesarion as Caesar's true heir and dividing eastern territories among their children. To Octavian in Rome, this was outrageous. It looked like Cleopatra and Antony were creating a new empire, a rival to Rome itself. The Romans hated Cleopatra not because she was foreign, or because she was a woman, but because she was powerful. To them, she represented the danger of Eastern luxury, decadence, and influence over Roman men. Propagandists described her as a sorceress who ensnared Antony with magic and lust. Octavian, in particular, cast her as the ultimate villainess, a foreign queen threatening the moral fabric of Rome. In reality, Cleopatra was playing her cards with precision. She knew that aligning with Antony meant making Rome itself her rival, but it was a risk worth taking. For nearly a decade, she and Antony ruled the Eastern Mediterranean as though they were king and queen of a new world order. Of course, their story ended in tragedy. At the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, Octavian's forces defeated Antony and Cleopatra's fleet. Their dream of an Eastern empire collapsed, and Rome's propaganda machine went into overdrive. Antony was painted as a weak man undone by a dangerous woman. Cleopatra was branded a temptress who ruined generals and kingdoms. The truth was far more complex. Together, they had challenged Rome and lost. Looking at these stories, it's tempting to see Cleopatra only through the lens of romance. But the crazy fact is this. Her relationships with Caesar and Antony were less about passion than about survival and strategy. Cleopatra wasn't simply in love with two powerful men. She was ensuring Egypt's independence in a world dominated by Rome. In the end, her gamble didn't succeed. But for decades, she kept Egypt sovereign against impossible odds. And she did it by wielding love not just as an emotion, but as a political weapon. When most people think of Cleopatra's death, they imagine a queen lying on a golden couch, a basket of figs at her side, and a venomous asp slithering across her skin. It's a haunting image, romantic, tragic, unforgettable. But behind the myth lies something equally fascinating: Cleopatra's real interest in science, medicine, and poisons. She was not just a queen of politics and spectacle. She was also a curious experimenter, a woman who pushed the boundaries of knowledge in search of both beauty and power. Cleopatra lived in Alexandria, home to the legendary library and museum, one of the greatest centers of learning in the ancient world. While much of the library has been lost, ancient sources tell us that she herself wrote treatises on medicine, cosmetics, and even alchemy. Though the works are lost, later writers like Galen, the great physician, mention her recipes for ointments and remedies. She was especially fascinated with perfumes. Some formulas attributed to her survived through centuries, blending oils, spices, and resins into intoxicating scents. But perfumes were only one side of her curiosity. Cleopatra was interested in the line between medicine and poison, and she had the resources and the ruthlessness to explore it. Roman sources, hostile as always, accuse Cleopatra of testing poisons on condemned prisoners. According to Plutarch and others, she studied which toxins killed swiftly, which caused lingering pain, and which left a person unconscious before death. She reportedly observed bites from snakes, scorpions, and other venomous creatures. Was this pure propaganda, painting her as a cruel witch? Possibly. But given her position as a queen constantly threatened by assassination and betrayal, her obsession makes sense. Poison was the weapon of the court. Knowing its secrets could mean survival. All of this ties into the most enduring story about Cleopatra, her death by asp. After Antony's suicide and Octavian's capture of Alexandria, Cleopatra realized she would be paraded through Rome in chains. For a queen who had styled herself as Isis incarnate, this humiliation was unthinkable. The legend goes that she arranged for a basket of figs to be smuggled into her chambers, concealing a venomous asp inside. After eating the fruit, she reached into the basket, allowed the serpent to strike, and died with her dignity intact. 2 of her attendants, Eris and Charmian, supposedly died with her, ensuring her secret stayed protected. It's a story of theatrical perfection. A queen who lived with spectacle chose to die with spectacle. But was it true? Many modern historians doubt it. First, the logistics are tricky. How do you hide a deadly snake in a fruit basket without it escaping? Second, Egyptian cobras, the likeliest asp, usually kill slowly, not instantly, and often leave a very visible wound. Ancient sources differ. Some claim Cleopatra pricked herself with a poisoned needle. Others suggest she carried a vial of venom mixed into a salve. So why the snake? Because it was symbolic. In Egyptian culture, the cobra, the uraeus, was a royal emblem, the serpent goddess that sat on the pharaoh's crown. By dying from a serpent's bite, Cleopatra aligned her death with divine imagery. To Egyptians, it was a noble, even sacred passing. To Romans, it was a convenient story, a dramatic, exotic death for the foreign temptress. Everyone, in other words, had a reason to keep the asp legend alive. Beyond her death, Cleopatra's reputation as a scientific queen endured. Later, writers credited her with recipes for skin care, treatments for hair, and even eye cosmetics, the same coal-lined look immortalized in art and film. Some formulas mixed honey, vinegar, and minerals still used in folk remedies today. While it's impossible to know how much she truly discovered, her image as a woman who blurred the line between queen, chemist, and alchemist persisted through the ages. So, was Cleopatra a cruel experimenter, or a curious scientist ahead of her time? The truth may be both. She lived in a world where rulers used every tool available, from armies to poisons, to protect their crowns. Her interest in medicine was not eccentric. It was practical. Her fascination with perfumes was not frivolous. It was part of her identity, as a goddess queen. And her death, whether by asp, needle, or potion, was not just an end. It was a carefully chosen act of political theater. That's the crazy fact about Cleopatra. She turned even death into a performance, leaving behind a mystery that still captivates the world 2,000 years later. If power was Cleopatra's weapon, luxury was her armor. The Queen of the Nile lived in a world of unimaginable splendor, not as frivolous excess, but as a calculated display of divine authority. In the ancient world, wealth was not hidden behind palace walls. It was performed. And Cleopatra, more than any monarch before or after, turned her opulence into art. Cleopatra ruled from Alexandria, one of the richest cities in the world. Its harbor glittered with ships from India, Greece, and Arabia, carrying spices, pearls, ivory, and silks. Inside the royal quarter stood the fabled palace of the Ptolemies, a complex of marble halls, fountains, and gardens that seemed to float upon the Mediterranean. Contemporary accounts describe floors of gold, walls inlaid with precious stones, and furniture carved from ebony and ivory. But Cleopatra's wealth wasn't just inherited, she expanded it strategically. She revived Egypt's economy through trade, controlled lucrative routes along the Red Sea, and taxed Roman merchants who depended on her grain. While Rome's senators mocked her decadence, they relied on her ships to feed their people. That was Cleopatra's genius. Even her luxury was political leverage. Nowhere was her sense of theatrical power more obvious than in her famous meeting with Mark Antony at Tarsus. As her barge drifted up the Cydnus River, it wasn't just a royal visit, it was a declaration of divinity. Purple sails billowed above her, dyed with Tyrian purple, a color so rare it cost more than gold. The scent of incense filled the air. Oars of silver flashed in the sunlight as her attendants, dressed as cupids and sea nymphs, rode to the rhythm of flutes. Cleopatra reclined beneath a canopy of gold, shimmering like the goddess Isis herself. Crowds gathered along the riverbank, believing they were witnessing a deity, not a mortal queen. Antony, proud, powerful Antony, was utterly overwhelmed. Cleopatra hadn't just arrived. She had staged an entrance for eternity. And then, of course, there's one of the craziest stories in all of ancient history. During one of her famous banquets with Antony, Cleopatra boasted she could spend the equivalent of millions of dollars on a single meal. Antony laughed. "Impossible," he said. So Cleopatra removed one of her priceless pearl earrings, ground it into powder, dropped it into a goblet of vinegar, and drank it. The acid, according to legend, dissolved the pearl, and with one sip, she swallowed a fortune. Whether that story is chemically possible or not, it didn't matter. It became legend. Cleopatra's feast was a masterclass in spectacle, a performance of limitless wealth and fearless confidence. In that single gesture, she outshone every Roman general who mocked her, and proved that in the game of luxury, Egypt reigned supreme. Cleopatra and Antony's court became infamous for its indulgence. They called themselves the inimitable livers, a society dedicated to excess and pleasure. Their banquets were drenched in gold and perfume. Their floors were strewn with rose petals so thick guests had to wade through them. Yet even this decadence served a deeper purpose. In Egypt, kings and queens were expected to live like gods. Abundance wasn't sin. It was proof of divine favor. To ordinary Egyptians, Cleopatra's extravagance wasn't wasteful. It was sacred. When she appeared in jeweled robes, surrounded by incense and music, she wasn't just showing off. She was reaffirming the divine order of the cosmos, with herself at its radiant center. Cleopatra's luxury also served her politically. When Roman envoys visited, she dazzled them with gifts, gold, exotic animals, even ships, binding them with gratitude and awe. Her palace functioned as both temple and theater, every room designed to overwhelm the senses and remind visitors that they were in the presence of a living goddess. Crazy fact, ancient historians claimed her personal treasury was so vast that even after Rome seized Egypt, it covered a decade of military campaigns. She ruled not through brute force, but through economic dominance and psychological splendor. To her enemies, Cleopatra's riches symbolized corruption. To her people, they symbolized divine power. And to us today, they reveal a woman who understood the art of self-presentation better than any ruler in antiquity. Every pearl, every perfume, every glittering feast was part of a grand performance, not vanity, but strategy. Cleopatra's luxury was never mindless indulgence. It was a language, one that spoke of abundance, confidence, and unshakable sovereignty. She weaponized beauty, spectacle, and wealth to hold her throne against the might of Rome. So when we imagine Cleopatra shimmering beneath torchlight, sailing on perfumed winds, or drinking a pearl worth a kingdom, we're not just picturing decadence. We're seeing power in its most artistic form. A woman who turned her life into legend, one golden gesture at a time. Cleopatra's downfall didn't begin on the battlefield. It began with words. When Rome decided to destroy her, they didn't just target her armies. They targeted her reputation. What we think we know about Cleopatra, the seductress, the witch, the destroyer of men, is not really Cleopatra at all. It's the product of one of the most ruthless propaganda campaigns in history. After the defeat at Actium in 31 BCE, Cleopatra and Mark Antony's alliance collapsed. Their enemy, Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, was determined to claim sole power over Rome. But to do that, he had to justify why he was turning Roman legions against another Roman, Antony. He needed a villain. Enter Cleopatra. Octavian's strategy was genius in its cruelty. He portrayed Antony not as a political rival, but as a man corrupted, bewitched by a foreign queen who had poisoned his loyalty to Rome. Cleopatra was cast as a sorceress, a manipulator, a woman who used sex and magic to enslave the minds of men. This narrative allowed Octavian to shift blame. Antony wasn't betraying Rome of his own accord. He was a victim of Cleopatra's spells. It was the perfect story to rally public outrage and make war seem righteous. Octavian's propaganda machine went into overdrive. Pamphlets, speeches, and even coins portrayed Cleopatra as a threat to civilization itself. She was described as a fatal monster, a plague to mankind, and the shame of the East. Roman poets like Horace and Propertius painted her as a drunken temptress surrounded by barbaric luxury, gold, eunuchs, and serpents. The idea of Eastern decadence became the enemy of Roman virtue. In Octavian's story, Rome represented order, discipline, and morality, while Egypt, under Cleopatra, represented chaos, indulgence, and immorality. It was more than propaganda. It was cultural warfare. The irony, of course, was that Rome had long admired Egypt's art, science, and wealth. But when politics demanded it, admiration turned to disgust. Cleopatra became the ultimate scapegoat. A woman, a foreigner, and a symbol of power that men couldn't control. Octavian understood something few others did, the power of imagery. When his troops captured Alexandria, he made sure that Cleopatra's treasures, including her lavish throne and ship ornaments, were paraded through Rome. To the cheering crowds, these displays were proof of victory over a dangerous queen. Then came the coup de grace. Octavian ordered coins and monuments celebrating his triumph over Egypt. In one stroke, he rewrote history. Antony was forgotten, Cleopatra was demonized, and Octavian became the savior of Rome. Crazy fact, Octavian even forbade public mourning for Antony in Rome, but allowed Cleopatra's death to be dramatized. The snakebite, the gold couch, the exotic imagery. He understood that her death could serve his story better than her life ever could. The tragedy is that Cleopatra's own voice never survived. No letters, no memoirs, no Egyptian accounts written in her lifetime remain. Everything we know about her comes from Roman sources, her enemies' words. Even sympathetic writers like Plutarch lived a century later, filtering her story through the lens of Roman morality. So when we imagine Cleopatra as the scheming seductress who lured Antony to ruin, we are seeing her through the eyes of her conquerors. The real woman, the strategist, linguist, ruler, and scholar, was buried beneath the myths designed to destroy her. The smear campaign was effective because it tapped into Rome's deepest fears. A powerful, educated foreign woman who could rival their best generals? To Roman men, that was unnatural, even terrifying. By turning Cleopatra into a symbol of lust and danger, Octavian reassured the public that patriarchy and empire were safe. When he returned to Rome, he staged a triumph not over a queen, but over an idea. The idea that a woman could stand equal to Rome. Yet here's the great twist of history. Octavian's lies didn't destroy Cleopatra. They immortalized her. The same propaganda that vilified her ensured she would never be forgotten. Painters, poets, and playwrights for centuries would revisit her story. Sometimes as villainous, sometimes as heroine, always as legend. From Shakespeare to Elizabeth Taylor, every retelling is, in a way, a continuation of Octavian's myth. The real Cleopatra remains elusive, half buried beneath centuries of invention. But even so, she endures, not as Rome's monster, but as the woman who refused to bow to it. In the end, Cleopatra lost her empire, but won immortality. Octavian became Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. But when we speak their names today, it's hers that still gleams with mystery and fascination. His empire crumbled. Her legend never did. Every legend needs its ending. And Cleopatra's was one of the most carefully staged in history, a death wrapped in theater, politics, and mystery. In the summer of 30 BCE, after the defeat at Actium and the fall of Alexandria, Cleopatra's world collapsed around her. Her fleets were gone, her allies dead or defected, and Rome's legions filled the streets of her capital. Octavian's banners flew above the palace. The queen who had once ruled the Nile now faced the one fate she could not outmaneuver: conquest. Mark Antony, broken by defeat and betrayal, believed Cleopatra had already taken her own life. Desperate, he fell on his sword. But he didn't die, instantly. When news reached Cleopatra, she ordered her guards to bring him to her hiding place, a small mausoleum she had built in advance, filled with her treasures and her throne. According to Plutarch, Antony, bleeding and near death, was lifted up to her window by ropes. Cleopatra pulled him into her arms. The two embraced one last time as his life slipped away. Antony died in her presence, and Cleopatra, drenched in his blood, refused food or comfort. It's a scene almost too tragic to be real. Yet, in its details, we glimpse Cleopatra's unyielding spirit. Even as her kingdom crumbled, she controlled the narrative. She would not be taken prisoner at Antony's side. She would face Rome on her own terms. After Antony's death, Octavian entered Alexandria as conqueror. But instead of killing Cleopatra outright, he met with her privately. She appeared before him in mourning clothes, disheveled yet dignified. Ancient sources disagree on what passed between them, but all agree on one thing. Cleopatra was still trying to negotiate. She offered her throne, her treasury, even her son's future, anything that might preserve Egypt's sovereignty. She appealed not as a defeated woman, but as a ruler speaking to another ruler. Octavian, however, had already decided her fate. He would not kill her. He would humiliate her. He planned to parade her through the streets of Rome as a trophy in his triumph, the living proof of his victory over the East. For Cleopatra, that was worse than death. She knew what awaited her in Rome. She had seen how captives were marched in chains, displayed before jeering crowds. A queen, a goddess reduced to spectacle. For someone who had built her life on performance and power, that was an unbearable reversal. So Cleopatra began to plan her final act. Not as a victim, but as a director. She would choose the time, the place, and the symbolism of her own death. In her mausoleum, she ordered her servants to prepare a royal chamber filled with gold and incense. She wrote letters to Octavian, thanking him for his mercy, and requesting permission to make offerings at Antony's tomb. She was granted that wish, and in that brief moment of freedom, she set her stage. According to legend, Cleopatra dressed herself in her most regal attire, a golden robe, her crown upon her head, and jewels at her throat. She reclined on a couch of gold beside her two most loyal attendants, Eros and Charmian. A servant arrived carrying a basket of figs. Hidden within, perhaps, was the instrument of her death, the fabled asp, the sacred Egyptian cobra. Whether she reached into the basket or concealed a vial of poison within her jewelry, no one knows. Plutarch describes the scene with haunting simplicity. They found her lying dead upon a golden couch, arrayed in royal ornaments, with one of her maids dying at her feet, and the other adjusting the diadem upon her brow. In that image, Cleopatra achieves what no conqueror could take from her: control. Her final act was one of defiance and dignity. But did she really die by snakebite? Modern historians doubt it. Egyptian cobras rarely kill instantly, and their venom leaves obvious marks. Ancient accounts vary. Some say the bite was on her arm, others on her breast, still others that she used a poisoned needle hidden in a hairpin. What's certain is that the symbol of the asp mattered more than the reality. The serpent had long been Cleopatra's emblem, the uraeus that adorned the crowns of pharaohs, representing divine authority and protection. By choosing the serpent, Cleopatra didn't just end her life, she sanctified it. To the Egyptians, her death became a ritual of apotheosis, the mortal queen returning to her divine form as Isis. To the Romans, it was proof of her exotic danger, a fittingly theatrical end for the queen of poisons. When Octavian was informed of her death, he was furious. He had wanted her alive for his triumph, but even in death, Cleopatra had outwitted him. He ordered that her body be buried beside Antony's, a small concession to her final wish. Then, seizing her treasury, he declared Egypt a Roman province. In one stroke, the independent kingdom that had survived for 3,000 years was gone. Rome had conquered Egypt, but Cleopatra had conquered her conqueror's narrative. She would be remembered not as a captive, but as a queen who chose her own fate. For centuries, archaeologists have searched for Cleopatra's final resting place. Ancient writers said she was buried in a grand mausoleum near the sea, filled with gold, jewels, and her lover's ashes. But the tomb has never been found. Some believe it lies beneath modern Alexandria, lost to earthquakes and rising tides. Others think it rests near Taposiris Magna, a temple west of the city dedicated to Isis. Every so often, new discoveries rekindle hope, a statue here, an inscription there. But the queen's tomb remains elusive, as though she herself refuses to be unearthed. And perhaps that is fitting. For a woman who mastered the art of mystery, eternal obscurity is the perfect, final act. Cleopatra's death marked the end of Egypt's ancient dynasties and the dawn of the Roman Empire. Octavian became Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. Yet, despite his victory, history remembers him as conqueror and her as legend. She died young, around 39, but she lived enough lives for a dozen rulers: scholar, diplomat, goddess, lover, scientist, and queen. Her death was not the end of her story, but its transformation, from history into myth. Even now, more than 2,000 years later, we still speak her name with awe, not because she was beautiful or tragic, but because she was in control until her very last breath. And that may be the craziest fact of all. Cleopatra, faced with defeat, turned her death into immortality. Cleopatra's life ended in a quiet chamber, but her story never truly died. In the centuries that followed, her legend outlived empires. Kings and queens rose and fell, languages faded, and Rome itself crumbled. But the name Cleopatra endured, shimmering through history like sunlight on the Nile. In death, Cleopatra became larger than life. To the Romans, she was a cautionary tale, the dangerous foreign queen who dared to challenge their might. To Egyptians, she was the last pharaoh, the divine daughter of Isis, whose death marked the sunset of a 3,000-year civilization. And to later generations, she became something else entirely: a mirror. Each era remade her in its own image. The Renaissance saw her as the embodiment of tragic beauty. The Victorians made her the ultimate femme fatale, and in the modern age, she became a symbol of independence, a woman who refused to be defined by the men around her. From Shakespeare's verse to Elizabeth Taylor's violet eyes, every retelling reflects less about Cleopatra herself and more about the people who tell her story. That is her power, to transcend her own time and become timeless. Lost beneath the silks and serpents is another Cleopatra, the scholar queen. She was fluent in languages, skilled in diplomacy, and intimately involved in the economics and science of her kingdom. She kept Egypt stable for 2 decades during one of the most dangerous periods in its history, a time when lesser rulers were swallowed whole by Rome. That side of Cleopatra, the leader, the linguist, the strategist, is the one history nearly erased, buried under centuries of propaganda and fantasy. Yet it's the side that modern historians are reclaiming. When we strip away the myths, what remains is extraordinary. A woman who rose from political chaos, ruled an empire with intelligence and precision, and faced her death with dignity and control. Cleopatra's true triumph was not her throne, but her story. Few rulers have shaped their own image as completely as she did. Through pageantry, ritual, and legend, she ensured that she would never be forgotten. Even her death was a masterpiece of symbolism, a serpent's bite, a goddess's ascension. Today, her spirit survives everywhere, in art, in literature, in film, in the collective imagination of the world. She is not just a figure of the past. She is an idea. The idea that knowledge, confidence, and identity can be as powerful as any army. As we close this story, imagine her once more, the Queen of the Nile, standing on her palace balcony as the sun sets over Alexandria. The sea glows gold. The wind carries the scent of lotus and myrrh. She gazes toward the horizon, where history and legend meet. Her empire may have fallen, but her legacy did not. For 2,000 years she has ruled not from a throne of gold, but from the hearts of those who still whisper her name. And perhaps that is Cleopatra's greatest victory of all, not to be remembered as a woman who died for love, but as a woman who lived for power, intelligence, and destiny.